Hello, thanks for tuning into Fishbowl. It's your pal Shane Ford here. I'm going to walk you guys through a couple drawing exercises that I do. I try and do these as often as possible just to stay sharp, to mess around. I've been developing sketchbooks over the years just to practice, just to try new things. Here I'm going for a lady's face. So I'm drawing on a pretty smooth drawing paper. I don't like a particularly rough drawing paper. And these are red Prismacolor pencils. The reason why I go with Prismacolors is they're kind of waxy. They're very soft. So every kind of little subtle movement picks up on the paper. You know, you can be more expressive with your hand. You can move around. Even all those little scribbles kind of become a cool part of the drawing. So here I'm kind of moving through really light, just picking some shapes and stuff like that, kind of developing, you know, the jaw, the shadow under the jaw, things like that. I tend to draw this way because I find it's more exciting. You can get more energy into the face. Even those small kind of lines, you know, they end up kind of carrying through and, you know, making the drawing. So here going from, you know, not so soft, maybe picking some lines, committing more of the wax to the paper, kind of pressing down on it, bearing down on that pencil. I'll kind of go back and forth between, you know, really light pressure. And then once you find a line that you like, you really kind of want to send it home and kind of press down. But these pencils are tricky. They're very soft. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot where you're not snapping the tip off, but you're still kind of, you know, getting that line in there. You'll see also, like, as I draw, I'm kind of spinning the pencil. So as you kind of put in those darker shapes, you're going to sort of chisel down the tip of the pencil. So I'm kind of rotating it to always stay on the sharp side. Whereas if you want to do more of a gradient, more of a softer kind of thing there, I'm using that kind of chiseled side. So the tip of the pencil always kind of has like a point to 1 degree, sort of like a chisel tip kind of thing. And then I'm kind of rotating it in my hand just to always get it as sharp as possible. So here kind of moving into more details, kind of committing more stuff, trying to get some detail in the eye there. This isn't really anyone in particular. I think I'm just kind of drawing this out of my head. This is probably my go-to angle. I like a 3/4 angle. You know, I tend to draw in red. I'm not really sure why. The pencils themselves are my favorite. I think I've used them, you know, over 20 years. So they are very soft. They're very kind of brittle pencils. So if you drop one, chances are the lead inside is snapped. So if you put them in the microwave, they'll work again for you. Because they are a little expensive, so you don't want to just be throwing away full pencils and stuff. But for me, it's worth it. I've tried other pencils. I keep coming back to these ones, so I kind of stick with them. So again, kind of building up my shapes, getting more shadows in there. I don't really go top to bottom like a Xerox. I'm kind of jumping around. I'll pick a spot, kind of render it up, and then get out of there. I think that way you're kind of building the whole drawing at once. If you were going top to bottom, I think your values wouldn't be laid out enough. I like to kind of see everything develop all at once, or, you know, move around a little bit more. Just kind of go wherever my eye kind of wants to, you know, see more detail, see more shadow. I think I'm kind of jumping around there. These areas around the nose, I find if you lay in too much shadow, it takes away from how delicate the face is. I try not to put too much detail in there. I usually try and do like more of just a solid gradient. Have it kind of be very soft, just shading, no lines. Because, you know, those tend to kind of translate as almost wrinkles. And again, just jumping from place to place, you know, I'll develop a little bit, kind of jump over somewhere else. I put some shadow on the lip and stuff like that. This is all preferences to how you like to kind of shape them, you know. But usually you got a little bit of shine on that bottom lip, that kind of thing. And your highlights are obviously just what you're not rendering on the paper, so you're kind of leaving that out. And when it's all said and done, I think, you know, most of the pencil drawing is going to be rendered. I'll have kind of gone over it with some kind of a shade or a line or something. And then what you're leaving out is those, the whitest, the bridge of the nose, things like that. Those are your foremost highlights. So you kind of want to keep those as clean as you can. Another thing with these two is they're very soft. So if you're kind of dragging the palm of your hand around the paper, you're going to get pretty smudgy. So I think I'm kind of trying to be conscious of not putting my palm down. Or I have seen some people take a piece of tracing paper and place it under the palm, and then you're not smudging around. You don't kind of, depending if you're left-handed or right-handed, you don't have that kind of smudge at the bottom of the paper. But again, this is just for a sketchbook. It's not meant to be a completely rendered drawing for anything specific. It's just kind of for fun. I treat it as a drawing exercise, just practice really. I don't know that I would tattoo this necessarily, but I think it's all good practice for, keeping your hand moving. Maybe you find a different trick or a shadow that you'd never tried before. Maybe you record it and talk about it. But yeah, so I'll notice when people draw faces too, like everything is preference. So the way that you choose to shade under the nose, things like that. I think I probably go back and shade that part of the nose that's a little too light, because everything under the bridge of the nose would kind of be darker. So I'm hoping I go in there and fix that, because that's bugging me at the moment. So here, kind of committing down, that's the full value of the pencil. That's probably as hard as you would press before you snap the tip off and have to sharpen it again. Whereas here in the shading on the forehead and stuff like that, it's very light. I'm barely applying any pressure to the pencil. You're sort of almost gliding it across. So on this shot here, you can see the actual tooth of the paper. It's kind of rough. So hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of the smoothness I'm working with here. But if you go really smooth, it doesn't pick up as much of the wax off the pencil. So I do kind of like a little bit of a rough paper, I guess. Reason being, on those areas where you want to be as subtle as possible with the shading on the face and stuff like that, you don't have to apply much pressure, and you're still kind of getting those subtle tones and stuff like that. So looking a little cross-eyed here, but I'm pretty sure we pull it around, pretty sure we pull it together. One thing I have noticed too, on the actual white of the eye, I tend to use a lot of shadow. I think it gives it a little bit more emotion or a little bit more feeling. If those are straight white, it tends to look a little cartoony to me. So that's the intention there, and just kind of having that be as dynamic as possible. Again, in these cheekbones and these kind of areas where I'm moving through and kind of creating the lightest tone I possibly can, barely applying any pressure to the pencil. I'm probably, again, using that sort of chisel tip. So when you lay out those darker colors, you'll notice that the tip of your pencil kind of gets an angle to it. So I'll use that angle, the flat part, to lay down those sort of smoother gradients and stuff like that. And then by that same token, if I'm doing line work, I'll flip it to the sharp side, and you have a little bit more of a finer point. So here, lots of kind of light movement back and forth, not a lot of pressure on the pencil, just getting the lightest possible strokes and stuff that I can out of the pencil. And this might be something you want to experiment with, try different paper. I believe this one was actually a recycled paper of some kind. But yeah, that might be something you want to experiment with. Try different paper, maybe you like the look of something a little bit smoother, a little bit rougher. If it kind of has that sandy sort of look to it, maybe that's what you prefer. But I think I would definitely mess around with it, try some different stuff. Again, I don't really experiment too much with pencils. I'm a Prismacolor guy. I've used them the entire time I've been tattooing, so the amount of Prismacolors I've probably used in my lifetime is a lot. So shout out to those guys. So I think we kind of saved her from the cross-eyed maybe look that she had there for a little bit. We brought it back. And again, you can see the point on the pencil is super fine, just kind of grazing it across the top of the paper, not laying it down at all, barely any pressure, and just kind of whipping it around. Definitely having fun with it. There's no really right or wrong way to shade a face, but it's kind of a process of experimentation, You can't really erase on this kind of thing, so going lighter and kind of building it from the most subtle way up, I find is the easiest way to kind of have some kind of end result that you're happy with. If you go in with all the pressure on the pencil and you're laying down all that wax, it's kind of hard to come back from that. So you want to be as light and sort of experimental in the beginning, and then as you go, maybe kind of lay down the shapes that you're happier with, commit those shadows, that kind of thing. And of course, there's different angles you can experiment with. In this particular case, I don't think I'm looking at reference. I think this is just sort of out of my imagination, but I'll also do that too. I'll kind of, for this particular kind of drawing, I'll look at maybe a photo of an actress or a model or something. You can find it online or things like that. I like to reference sort of old black and white photography. Something about the way the photos were taken back then, it just seems to kind of establish the shadows in a cool way. You'll have those big, high contrast sort of areas of black and stuff. And I think that just kind of makes it more exciting to look at. And I like to use those for reference when I'm, drawing women's faces, drawing anatomy in general. I tend to think that a black and white reference photo just sort of isolates the shapes and the shading and stuff in a cool way, whereas color, maybe your brain is doing a little bit of work to try and decipher what is going where. So here, pretty scribbly through the hair, just trying out some different, flows with it and stuff like that. I tend to think that in the area behind the head there, you can say a lot more with just a solid patch of black than you can with, maybe detailing out all of the hair. And pretty scribbly, pretty loose. I'm just trying to find some flow in there. You have a little dangler coming down. Messing around with it. Just keeping this as an experiment, really. This is, I really enjoy drawing just for fun, just as an exercise. I think I've said before on the show, it's never a bad thing to be drawing, even if it doesn't come out to be something that could be tattooed or necessarily something that you feel like represents your work as a tattooer or just as an artist, but it's still fun to do. I think you always learn something just from sitting there at the table and messing around. So there it is. It's kind of my end result. I think the total drawing time on this one was about 3 hours, give or take, but obviously we sped up the footage. So there you go. Okay, now I'm going to get into a Copic marker koi fish. Copic markers are probably my favorite thing to draw with. I think it kind of mimics a watercolor painting in a cool way, but it speeds it up by a factor of 1,000. It's so much faster to draw with Copic markers. So I always start with painter's tape on a Arches hot press 300-pound piece of paper. The paper is a big deal. I wouldn't underestimate the paper. Once you get into kind of building gradients and stuff with Copic markers, that paper really has to hold up. It has to absorb a lot of the pigment from the markers. So if you get kind of a thinner, cheaper paper, you're going to end up kind of chewing it up once you lay down all of that pigment. The reason why I use painter's tape is because it's not super sticky. I've tried other tapes and it ends up kind of pulling some of the paper up with it, and it'll wreck that nice crispy border that you want to create. I just want to be able to kind of draw right over it without having to be aware of where that border is all the time. So here, kind of roughly just drawing in with a pencil, just a regular pencil, mechanical pencil. I think it's a 0.7 maybe, but just kind of mapping out where I want my water to go. We're going for a koi fish in the center, and then just some kind of cool background, black and gray type stuff. Water might be one of my favorite things to draw. Depending on who you talk to, there's 100 different ways to do it, but I tend to really enjoy it. It's probably my favorite thing to draw. So I'm using it as kind of the background for this piece, and then it's kind of a cool feature to get layers in there. You want some stuff kind of coming in front of the fish, coming behind the fish, and trying to go for kind of a more dynamic, like a 3D sort of, I guess you'd call it like a 3/4 angle on the fish, kind of popping out, showing his belly. And again, just getting my general idea here. Pretty non-committal with the line. I'll kind of, I'm not laying it down as a hard line. It's still kind of sketchy. So if I did have to erase it, I think you have a little bit more grace here and kind of erasing something, maybe moving it if you want. But as far as the sketch on this one, I think it went okay first pass. A nice little splash there, kind of coming out from the bottom. I'm a big fan of sort of creating that negative space out of the frame into the frame, because once we remove that tape, that border is going to be absolute white. So I think the thinking there is kind of having that wave come out of that white frame into the piece. It kind of breaks it up in a cool way. So getting into harder lines here. One thing I can't stress enough is to use a permanent liner for this. So this is a Stettler permanent fine tip pen. If you use something that is not permanent, once you start laying in your Copic markers and stuff, that thing is going to bleed all over the place and it's going to ruin a drawing. Trust me, I've done it a lot. So make sure that's permanent. The paper can take it if you're using a thicker paper. Now coming in with a number 5 Copic from the warm gray set. They do have a cool gray set too, which I've tried, but I find once you kind of have all that background in there, I just like the way that the warm gray looks. So that's what I use for all my pieces. Maybe for an excuse to get away from having a ton of black lines in there, I'm kind of lining with that number 5, my medium tone gray. So I'll have a dark, medium, and a light, and then I'll kind of play with like a very light, kind of subtle one in the waves. But for the most part, the basis of the piece is a dark gray, medium gray, and a light gray. And then of course, absolute black. So maybe for the purposes of just describing this, we'll call absolute black 10, and then this would be a 5, and then I'll use a 7 and a 3 as well. So just kind of getting my line work committed here, going through, keeping it really loose. You know, you can see that's pretty scribbly. I use the Copics with the brush tip because I feel like you can get those expressive lines. You can kind of whip it around. Similar technique to the pencil. I will kind of do my lines off the tip of the marker, and then you'll see in a moment, once we start doing gradients, you kind of use the side of the brush. So I'll sort of tilt it at maybe a 40-degree angle to the paper, and you're kind of whipping it. Getting some deets in here, kind of throwing in some thin deets. Again, permanent markers. This is a Stettler as well. I think it's the fine tip one. They do come in a couple different variations. I don't branch out too much and try the different ones. I'll kind of use the large one and the fine one. And just getting some details in here. Maybe some finer stuff. I find if you get your broad strokes as far as the big lines in first, and then you can go back in and detail it. I find I won't over detail it. If I go in with the details first, I tend to overdo it. So this is kind of an exercise in just restraint. Especially with a koi fish, I don't want to over detail things. I want to keep kind of a nice balance of line work and not have too much going on in there. So just being kind of selective with the details, getting my scales in there, and dots for the win. I don't know why I do dots, but you'll see throughout the piece, I like putting dots in there. I feel like it just kind of adds a little bit of character. It's kind of fun to do. Why not? So here, trying to navigate through what that transparency is going to be. Again, lining with my 5 Copic from the warm gray set. Kind of putting where that transparency is going to move over the body of the fish. The intention there is that you want that wave to kind of look like it's coming forward. And here, just kind of a creative choice. I think I wanted to create kind of just a, you know, like the tide was coming in or something, that kind of foamy type of ocean. That in combination with the finger waves that I've kind of added in there. It's just an excuse to get some motion into the piece, have things kind of moving, you know. Tell a story that the koi is kind of crashing up, coming through it. It just looks a little bit more chaotic. I find it adds a little bit to that kind of chaotic feeling if your lines are sort of almost sketchy or just loose, you know, which I really get from the brush tip pens. I think it just kind of puts a lot more energy into it if you're kind of whipping that stuff. It doesn't have to be perfect. I think it actually looks better if it's not. You know, so I think that's why I'm moving kind of quickly through here, just to kind of have that be really expressive. And here you can kind of see how loose it is, you know, some stuff isn't even lining up. But I think, you know, say you were to hang this on a wall or something, once you get up on it, I'd like to see that stuff in paintings. I like to see how loose it is. You know, you can see how the person's kind of mapping things out. Okay, so here I'm coming in with a 3. And again, from the warm gray set of Copics, the brush tip. Essentially, the body of a finger wave, in my opinion, should be negative space, but I do like to tint it a little bit because that's going to be the relief from your piece. So here again, this is the 3. This is probably the lightest tone of gray that I'll use. I want the bodies of those waves to be as light as possible, but still kind of have some dynamic sort of shading. I'm going for a little bit of a transparency on that right fin of his. So this is absolute black. That would be my 10. And then going in with a 7. So you can see I'm kind of whipping the black, which is where the brush tip comes in handy. It's an actual motion of your hand that you want to whip it. And you're kind of creating the illusion of there being a gradient there by just going down in denominations of marker. So if you go from a black to a 7 to a 5 to a 3, and you're using that whipping technique, then you can kind of get those big gradients that sort of move through the background. So again here, black to a 7 and kind of whipping over it. Using that brush tip to the advantage, you can see again I'm kind of tilting it at the side. You get more width of it that way. I think you can whip it better. Use the point of the brush tip to kind of maneuver around your fin there, get the details in, and then kind of go back to almost holding it on its side and kind of whipping it. So here's my 5 from the warm gray Copic set. So again, all my negative space that would kind of create the illusion of the tide or the water, I still kind of want to tint it just to have it be more exciting. So I'm kind of going through with that 5, still whipping it, whip city. Just make sure your hand gets moving as quick as possible. You can see the brush tip kind of picks up on the tooth of the paper in a cool way. I like how it kind of looks almost not super smooth, but it has a bit of a texture to it. That's one of my favorite things to try and create in a piece like this. And again, just kind of picking random details. So this would be sort of where I want to create a shadow with that piece of water that's coming in front of the fish. So in that transparency, I want it to kind of look pretty dark. So this is my 7. And then to the 5. So you're getting the gradient 2 ways. You're getting it by whipping the brush tip against the paper and kind of creating that transition. And then on top of that, you're kind of going down from a 7 to a 5 to a 3 to create even longer transitions. So most of these pockets behind the wave, I'm kind of creating those gradients by going darker to lighter to lighter. And creating a lot of shadow in this part, which is the transparency in front of the fish, giving the illusion that it's kind of underwater, but I'll still kind of illuminate some of the details of the fish beneath that. This is my 3 here. Just kind of creating some details on the wave. Again, absolute black. We're just gonna go right over that, I guess. That'll be our little secret. And trying to be a little bit intentional about being darker behind the fish, because eventually once we color it, it's going to push it forward if you have that contrast right next to it. Absolute black. Trying to create some deeper shadows in those sort of rolling waves that exist behind the koi. And then this is into a 7 here. So still just creating gradients out of grading down on the marker number and that brush technique of kind of whipping it against the paper. And here's my 5. And everybody loves dots. So again, once you're doing these gradients and stuff and you're kind of really sort of whipping over the paper, if you don't have a heavy enough paper that can absorb that kind of pigment, you're really just going to chew it up. These things do put down quite a bit of pigment. So yeah, you really need that absorption. I think that's how you can get away with doing some of this stuff where you're working maybe 2 or 3 colors over each other. A little bit of 7 action here. Dots. And then instead of tinting my negative space here with a 5, I think I came in with a 7 because this sort of is my deepest part of the background. So I think I'm trying to push that back by being a little bit darker in those negative areas. A little bit of absolute black here. And a nice close-up of Whip City. A little more Whip City. This is my 7 here on top of the absolute black. So maybe a good example of kind of, that's a smoothness level that I'm happy with. I'm not looking for the, super smooth kind of stuff. You're gonna have a little bit of brushstroke in there, a little bit of paper texture. I like how that stuff looks. Once you take a step back from the piece, if it's hanging on the wall, you really don't notice. And again, you can kind of see my pencil sketch under there, like bleeding into the Copic. I believe they're alcohol based, so you do kind of you'll get a little bit of bleeding from that pencil sketch. I suppose if you did your line drawing with the permanent markers, you could go back and erase the pencil sketch if you didn't want it to bleed into your lighter tones. But I honestly don't mind it. I think it looks cool. I think it kind of shows that it's hand drawn. There's kind of a cool character to it in my opinion. So I keep it in. I like it. A little bit of 7 there. I think the thinking with that closest wave that's filled with the 7 kind of looks like it pops forward a little bit. So any excuse to create some depth, have things look like it's kind of an endless ocean behind them, going on forever. Like that's kind of the cool vibe to have. A little bit of 5-age. 5-age on the negative space in the background, a little bit darker. Dots, 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 details, details. But here you kind of have to step back and those transitions look a little bit smoother. Once you're right up on it, you can definitely see the strokes and the paper texture, but at a glance, kind of smooth. Getting a little bit of scales. Going for the second transparency here, kind of have it look like it's moving through the water. I think I do end up creating a shadow over this portion that I'm scaling right now. And again, just to have that look like it's kind of behind water. There we go. So this is my 7. Whip, whip, whip. And let's go 7 all the way down. So now I've kind of created that transparency. That's the illusion I'm going for, is to try and make it look translucent. Okay, so getting into some color. If you can notice in my left hand, I have 3 tones. I tend to generally work in thirds. So this is kind of a darker burgundy color. Just going through and kind of laying down some scale detail. The thinking here is that I want to create a transition from the right to the left within the whole fish. So I'm going to start with my darkest color, and then I'm going to move through the scales, kind of creating a lighter and lighter effect. The beautiful thing about Copics is you can layer them. So I'm going right over that 7 gray, 7 to the 5 gray on the fin here, and that the tones still exist under the red. So the more you layer it, if you have good enough paper that can handle that kind of pigment, you can get more and more subtle the more layers you create. So again, can't stress it enough, use heavy paper. So this is my mid-tone red. I'm kind of same thing I did with the 7 to the 5. I'm doing the mid-tone from the dark burgundy to this kind of red. I guess you'd call it. It's kind of an orangey red. I believe the color is called salmon, but I could be wrong. And the thinking is the same as the grays in the background, the 7 to the 5. We'll call that dark red my 7. This mid-tone would be my 5. So I'm just working in thirds, going from dark to light. So in the same way that I created the scale pattern with the dark red, now I'm moving to the medium red. So I have my transition of kind of dark to light off the spine to the belly. And a lot of whipping. And this is dealer's choice, how much you want to create the details in the face, that kind of thing. So same thing here, my darkest tone of red, whipping it out there across the fin, Whip City. Whip City. Then to my medium, same approach. Dark to light, whip them over each other, and then kind of spread that one out. Try and follow the lines of the detail on the fin. I feel like that adds a little bit of energy if you sort of take the same course. Trying to keep that negative part of the wave on the fin as a transparency, so I wouldn't run any medium tones through there. I'm just trying to get some details in there, still whipping. Trying to be pretty reserved about how far I take this red in, because I want to leave space for my lightest color. And I still want to have that transition be as subtle as possible. Maybe a little bit of red behind the head there just to have no white on white. I lose some contrast there. A little bit more whips, trying to get that as subtle as possible. Tiny bit of medium tone red there in the transparency. So now we're moving to my lightest tone. So this would be kind of like a peach color. And this is a good place to experiment. If you grab yourself a bunch of Copics, grab a piece of paper and whip them over top of each other, because you want those colors to kind of be in the same hue. And the way that the colors are coded with the Copics, all of the reds, all of the greens, all of the grays are within one color code. So they're kind of meant to blend in this way. So they kind of make it easy for you to find colors that are going to work over top of each other. Here I'm kind of getting that last tone. And again, like I mentioned, my underlying pencil sketch does bleed into these lighter tones, but I almost don't mind it. I think it kind of looks cool. I've tried it both ways, where I'll go through and erase all the pencil, and it does end up being a little bit cleaner. And you can always go through after and kind of erase it too if it bugs you. So here, that transparency into my lightest tone all the way through the wave, trying to create a gradient from the bottom of the fin to the top. And leaving the tips of those fins negative space. I'm going to leave the belly negative too, I think. So in the same way that I wanted the bodies of the waves to be negative, I want the belly of the fish to be negative, but I still want to tint it a little bit. So I'm using the lightest tones I have to just kind of manipulate that negative space a little bit. I still think that goes a long way in trying to make the piece more dynamic. It's my darkest tone of red in my transparency here. And like I said, that darker tone of red is still going to be tinted by that 7 warm gray that I have underneath there. Medium tone red. Medium tone red again. Whip, whip. Whip City. And my lightest tone. And a medium tone red in the transparency. Go over all my negative. You can see how aggressive I'm whipping it by how the paper is moving. I'm really putting a lot of pressure and then whipping that. A little bit of my darkest tone red here. And throw a little bit of detail in the eye, a little pupil. I think this is my medium tone and the lightest tone. The removal of the tape, always the best part. Even if it bleeds a little bit into the tape underneath, again, I think it looks kind of cool. It doesn't have to be super crispy. Throw a little signature on there. I'll usually put the date, and there you have it. Koi fish, Copics. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Hope this helps you in your drawing process. Take it easy.